super exciting for me. I'm talking tonight about transgender identities in the ancient world. My name is Freya Serafina. I use she, her pronouns. I'll walk around a few times. Maybe I'll stay here for a minute. Okay. So just to give you a little taste of what's going on and what I'm covering tonight. So we're going to look at some artwork and iconography from ancient Crete. Then we're going to go over to take a look at the cult of Cybele and Attis in Phrygia/Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. We're going to look at some writing from the world's first author, Enheduanna, when she talks about the Sumerian goddess Inanna, as well as Inanna's devotees. And we're going to jump on over to the Reed Marsh people, Moses, Jesus, and John the Baptist in both the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. So it's a lot of information in a short amount of time. When I recorded this, it was too long, so I'm going to try and keep it as brief as possible. Yes, if you are grabbing one of these cards hanging around, they are some sources if you want to go and look at this work, check this work out. And maybe it's getting darker, but we can see this here. So my standpoint, why do I even want to talk about this, or who am I, what rights do I have? I guess rights isn't really the great word, right? But I am a bisexual cisgendered woman, an ally. So my background, I have degrees in theater and film. I'm a theater and film professor, so when I approach certain topics, I'm really looking at things like symbolism, imagery, the subtext, reading through the lines. I'm currently a PhD student in religion philosophy with a focus in women's spirituality. I found a really interesting connection between theater and ritual, and I've kind of been on that track ever since. I'm a pagan goddess worshipping ex-Catholic, so that's where I come in the way that I approach certain texts that I'm looking at. There are other chairs too, if you want those white chairs as well, if they're cozier if you want them. And I'm really focused in my research on decolonizing and dismantling patriarchal religious and spiritual structures, which is why I'm doing this event. I'm really big on shedding light on things that have been hidden, lots of secrecy, why that's happened, how it's affected us in the modern day, because I feel if we did more of that, we would move towards a true gender equality, among other things. So we begin in the beginning. So as we probably know, gender transgression and non-binary identities, they're nothing new. This is not a new phenomenon. Nobody dropped out of the sky and landed, and now we have the queer agenda, right? So in fact, multi-gendered identities can be traced back to all of these ancient civilizations that I've mentioned and beyond. If I were to cover every instance, we'd be here for a really long time, which is not going to happen. So I'm going to do my best. So ancient gods, goddesses, and their devotees have long since transgressed beyond the boundaries of modern-day constructed gender to do lots of things like wage mighty wars, generate life, and participate in religious rites and rituals. So this fear and hatred in our so-called modern society is a direct symptom of colonial practices that sought to eradicate pre-existing deities and supplant patriarchal monotheistic deities in their stead. So I feel that an exploration of the history of gender transgression among deities and devotees can reveal how decolonizing religion could help provide us with a path forward. So we're going to start by looking at a bunch of pictures, which is why I'm very upset that it's not darker, but I do have my laptop here as well, and the sun will begin to go down as we go on. Along with literary evidence as well, we're going to start in Crete, looking at those images. Hi, Mama. That's okay. But a really important thing that we should answer first is, how do we even know what we're looking at? How do we know how we're interpreting these images? What's going on? So we're going to start by looking at ancient frescoes and other kinds of artwork. So how do we even know the difference between men and women when we look at ancient artwork? Well, I'll tell you. Men are typically dressed in the kind of loincloth and they're shirtless, and the women are in dresses, but additionally, women are typically painted with white skin and men with tan or dark skin in the ancient world. So there's an associate professor of classics and a former head of her department, Marianne Everly, and she tells us that one of the most obvious stylistic features of the Athenian black figure vase painting is the use of color to differentiate women from men. So I'll show it to you. So in her book, it's called Tan Men, Pale Women, go figure, Color and Gender in Archaic Greece and Egypt. She contemplates the use of color in both Greece and Egypt through the lens of gender. So we know that what she has found, I've got it here, what she has found is that this is an incredibly common practice, not just in Greece and Egypt, but across the ancient world. So when you first take a look at these images and you can see them side by side, the color of the painted skin actually has nothing to do with their race and has everything to do with whether they are men or women. So that's one way that we can identify this. So when we find a fresco that shows tan figures donning feminine clothing, what do we assume? We have to pause and wonder. So here are some examples of what I'm talking about. Let's dig into Crete in a little bit. So I hope you can see some of these. So in Crete, what you can see is that they have all pale skin, their breasts are usually exposed. In the middle here we have tan-skinned men in loincloths, bringing libations, and we have the Cretan snake goddess. Her skin is lighter, she's obviously holding snakes, that's why she's a snake goddess, and her breasts are typically exposed. When the breasts are exposed, that often has to also indicate that either it's a representation of the goddess or a priestess acting as a goddess. If we move to Egypt, these are both from the Theban tomb. So we see a variety of darker skin, and we see a variety of lighter skin. Some of the breasts are exposed, some are not. When I say usually, the things that sometimes change is that the gods or the dead can be blue or any color. So we can see that here, but then we can see men and women. And what's interesting about some of this artwork here is that they're holding a bunch of instruments. And there's circles and symbols and reeds, and we're going to get to all of that. And I have a replica of one of those instruments here as well. So these are the Athenian, the Greek pots. This is kind of obvious. We've even got a lady horse over there. So we've got a bunch of different people. This one's pretty obvious. He's got very dark skin, but he's old, so he has white hair. But here's something pretty interesting. And this is on display at the Met. It's an oil flask, and it says on the Met, on the shoulder, a seated woman, perhaps a goddess, is approached by 4 youths and 8 dancing men. So I want to point out that she's holding a kind of tambourine, but 8 dancing maidens? Their skin is dark. And they're approaching a goddess. How are they maidens? So this is where we begin to go, well, wait a second. What's going on here? For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to use a lot of language that says men turning into women and women turning into men, just to demonstrate what we're seeing visually, but that's no way to indicate that people are transforming into something that they don't feel that they are. So I just want to point that out as well as we continue. But we see in the dress, my feeling is that these are a group of Galli or Galator, which I'll explain in a moment, leading initiates to the goddess. So let's dig right in, and we'll start with Crete. Maybe. Okay, so there it is, way at the bottom. And Crete is a fascination to scholars across many different fields for many different reasons. So it's got a rich artistic culture. It was egalitarian or matrilineal, which means that it wasn't patriarchal. There was a mother goddess and a mother figure, and that's how the lineage went. There's lack of any evidence pertaining to war or warlike culture. There's both textual and archaeological evidence that highlights Crete's reputation for cultivating a harmonious and lavish culture. So according to Dr. Mara Keller, the ancient names for the island of Crete include Macaris, which means country of the blessed, and Chthoniya, which is the name of the Earth Mother Goddess herself. So Keller tells us that Homer actually described Crete in the Odyssey as lavishly fruitful and radiant. And additionally, Pliny, the Roman naturalist, stated that the animal and plant life found on Crete was incomparably better than anywhere else. So okay, we've got great, rich landscape. Awesome. But now what? There's also accounts of the rich architecture and artwork in still standing palaces like the palace at Knossos. So this is an artistic recreation of what they feel like. But it lacks a lot of color. As you can see from these more recent images, lots of reds. This would be a throne room where libations were brought. The goddess or a priestess acting as a goddess would be here. What's interesting about that image up here, which I have a closer image of. Oh, we jumped all the way to the end. I promise you, that's not what I want. Well, what's interesting about that image and what you'll see is that there's a giant bull. And there was a festival every year where they would jump the bull. And there are some really interesting images from jumping the bull that I will show you. But here's a closer one. You can see the bull more closely up on that fresco. And the rich, rich colors that are still here. So this is the procession. So as you can see, the palace at Knossos was a central community complex for those living in ancient Crete. The palace remnants were discovered by an excavator named Sir Arthur Evans in 1900. What they found were a handful of different sort of palaces, and it was used as a center of arts, commerce, and ritual worship. And inside the palace, one can find private rooms and dwellings, and lots of sculptures. But more significantly are the frescoes that we find. So this fresco is known as the Great Procession, and it can be found in a passageway known as the Corridor of Procession because we're not very creative when we name things. And it contains 3 elements that speak to goddess worship. So part A, it'll split part A, part B, and part C. And I'll take it a little closely in a second. But what we see in part A, which is all the way on my right, of the procession shows men dressed as women playing various instruments, following a woman who is clapping her hands. Part B shows men gathered around a woman in a headdress, which is usually meant to depict the goddess, or a priestess acting as a goddess. As you can see, her breasts are exposed as well. And part C, they praise her with their hands, and part C shows men carrying vessels, typically referred to as libation bearers. So my assertion is that the men depicted in this procession fresco are actually Galli, or men that are in service to the goddess. And as you can see, this is pretty apparent to me. Okay, so we've established that women have pale skin and men have tan skin, and that men expose their chests and wear a loincloth, and women wear dresses. But these people, with the same hairstyle as this woman, with dark skin, are wearing dresses, and they are part of the procession. And it's important, I'd like to point out, that they are carrying a bunch of instruments, because this iconography is going to carry us over. In the front there are cymbals or tambourines, a flute, a lyre of some kind, and what's known as a sistra, bringing up the rear. And this will matter. As we continue to move forward, we're going to see a ton of imagery where these attendants to the goddess are the ones that carry all the instruments and move the procession forward. So in the modern tongue, these men dress as women, taking on the roles and attributes of women. We could apply the term transgender, or even non-binary. The images, along with the various documentation from the ancient world, depict a world full of devotees who transgress the boundaries of gender in religious practice. So let's keep that wonderful image in mind as we move over. Oh, yes, I have more. Good for me. So here's another one. from Crete. And if you notice, it's just a bunch of women, all dressed. Some have pale skin, and some have dark skin. And the dress is the same, the hairstyle is the same. And I have a close-up of my girl at the bottom right here. Dark skin. Ah, yes. So, admittedly, as we move through this presentation, there is a lot more imagery of men that transgress or take on the attire and the station of women, and not as much imagery the other way around. But this one is always very interesting to me. So this is the jumping of the bull that I mentioned earlier. And as you can see, there is a dark-skinned individual in a loincloth riding the bull, and a light-skinned person with no breasts and a loincloth on either side. One's grabbing the bull by the horns, good for him, and one's getting ready to jump. But women have light skin. Why are they dressed as men? So, we move over to Phrygia, which is inside Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. And we move to Attis and Sicily. So it's also important to mention that the word cult back in those times is very, very different than how, right? It brings all sorts of associations and imagery to mind, but a religious cult in this day and age is simply a group of people who probably got together on a Friday and hung out and worshiped the gods in the woods and like ate and drank and possibly had sex. So like it's like the same and different. No one was being held against their will that we know of. So it's important to mention that. That's Attis. So the Galli were priests devoted to the Phrygian or Anatolian goddess Cybele. I say Cybele, I've heard Cybele. I'm not sure if there's a consensus. I'm going with Cybele. Phrygia was located in central Anatolia, which is now modern-day Turkey. The main goddess cult in ancient Phrygia was dedicated to both Cybele and Attis. And the tale of Attis is a really sad one, as most tales are. So the tale of Attis actually begins with the assault of his grandmother Cybele by the god Jupiter. And whoever does the assaulting changes from culture to culture. But because of that, Cybele gave birth to a demon named Atistus, who caused great destruction until the gods castrated him. And the blood that spilled onto the earth caused an almond tree to grow. This is very indicative of many, many ancient tales. Blood falls onto the earth, a tree, a fruit, something grows, and because of that, somebody gets pregnant, essentially. That is a story that happens very, very often in many, many different cultures. So the goddess Nana ate the fruit, and the almond tree gave birth to Attis 10 months later. Another interesting thing is most pregnancy stories and cycles in the ancient world are 10 months and not 9. Just a little thing to keep in mind. So Nana cast Attis aside. She said, "No, I don't want the child of an almond." And instead of succumbing to death as an infant, he grew to be this beautiful, beautiful boy, and everybody loved him and everybody wanted him. And then Cybele said, "Well, wait a minute, he's beautiful, I want him." Because there's nothing like a good incest story, right? So she pined for her own grandson, naturally, but upon hearing of his betrothal to another drove him to madness. And he ran through the mountains, and he stopped in a pine tree before castrating and killing himself. But instead of letting his body decay, Cybele cried and cried, and, "Hey, welcome, find a seat. There are also drinks we can get." Oh, yes, everyone, there are also more drinks. We can always get filled. Come back. Instead of letting his body decay, both the pine tree and Cybele tended to it, allowing for Attis's resurrection. And you guessed it, that was a 3-day cycle. Death, cleansing, resurrection. So actually there are a lot of people who say Attis Isis and Osiris, and some of the other stories we see. But we know that they are much earlier than the Christ resurrection cycle, and a lot of them are basically the same. So we had castration, purification, and resurrection of Attis's body. There he is lounging. Okay. So throughout the ancient world, there were various temples, rituals, poems dedicated to the cult of Attis. The cult of Attis and Cybele rivaled that of almost every other religion in the Mediterranean. So Latin poet Catullus wrote what is now called Poem 63. I'm sure that's not what he named it at the time. During the 1st century BCE, and in it, he recounts the story of Attis along with his frenzied madness and eventual castration. Catullus tells us that by emasculating himself through the act of castration, Attis becomes a counterfeit woman. Upon waking the next morning, Attis's gender is automatically shifted from he to she. So there's a translation here. Carried in a fast ship over profound seas, Attis, eager and hurried, reached the Phrygian grove, the goddess's dark places crowned with woodland. And here, exalted by amorous rage, his mind gone, he cut off his testicles with a sharp flint. She then, aware of her limbs without the man, while the ground was still spotted with fresh blood, quickly took in her snowy hands the tambourine. We've seen the tambourine before in the procession. Such as serves your initiates, Cybele. So everybody knows this is what happens. That's just what happens, obviously. This is how you serve Cybele, is you castrate yourself and you pick up the tambourine. Such as serves your initiates. So after transforming himself into a woman, Attis then takes up the tambourine as a galley and becomes a, quote, slave of Cybele. The galley were representative of Attis as they too castrated themselves as a symbol of reunification with the great mother goddess. So what we know of the meaning behind the roles of the galley, along with the rites and rituals, is given to us from many different sources that sought to defame pagan activities and demonize goddess worship. But thanks to them, we have the evidence all the same, and we just sort of have to sift through it and pick it apart. Arnobius of Sicca, who was a convert to Christianity, he wrote 7 books at the end of the 3rd century CE, titled Against the Pagans. In it, he detailed the myths of Attis, making sure to infuse the tale with blood, terror, incest, female breast mutilation, castration, death, and more. It's like Game of Thrones, but finished. He finished the book. So these depictions of pagans as violent, frenzied mutilators who worship gods, who raped and lusted after their grandchildren, was definitely a way to demonize and invalidate a religious practice that actually detailed the birth, death, the regeneration cycle, and the changing of the seasons. So according to Will Roscoe, who wrote Priests of the Goddess, Gender Transgression in Ancient Religion, Christian apologists cited the galley as representative of all they abhorred in pagan culture and religion. So the galley transgressed the boundaries of gender, worshipped a mother goddess, and chose to live their lives as women instead of men. That's clearly a horrible thing to choose. So another important distinction in regard to Cybele and the galley is that the cult of the goddess found its way into Roman culture and political activity, which it does in Sumer as well. So whenever something enters political activity, it becomes a little more important. Why? Because now it's not just speculation or flowery language or poem or 7 books against the pagans because you're angry. It's no, you have to pay taxes or you have to answer to some kind of law because of your status or station in life. So the galley were first encountered and written about by the Romans in their campaigns into Asia Minor in 190 and 189 BCE. At that time, the galley were fully functioning as officials and priests of an urban, developed, and theocratic city, marking the development of cultural city centers as places for gender diversity. The galley were such a common sight throughout the Roman Empire that their presence can be found and seen in various texts from writers like Ovid, Seneca, and more. And the significance of Cybele and her followers, lives in the hearts of worshippers across the ancient world, coupled with her devotees, the Galli, who push the boundaries of normal gender distinctions, would prove to be a dangerous obstacle for patriarchal societies to come. On to Sumer. Oh. Here are some tombstones of Galli. What you'll notice are those cymbals, tambourines, another kind of drum, libations, wheat or reeds. He's holding pomegranates, and there's always some kind of crown, which we know from Crete is representative of the goddess in some way. So these are important images, and these are again from tombs. So, traveling across the continent to the ancient Near East, we arrive in the lands of Mesopotamia, Sumer, and Babylonia. Here we encounter the Progara, the Galator, or the Pili Pili, depending on who you ask. I prefer Pili Pili because it's fun to say. Okay. So, Ilan Peled recounts the creation of two gender-fluid beings in the goddess Inanna's descent into the underworld, in a text called Gender Ambiguity and Contempt in Mesopotamia. So if you don't know, very briefly, the goddess Inanna, the queen of heaven and earth, she wants to go visit her sister Ereshkigal, the goddess who rules the underworld, but you don't come back from there. So she has to do a bunch of things and enlist attendants and helpers and make sure that her body comes back. You guessed it, 3 days. So in order to get there, she has to give off a bunch of things from her body that are sacred, sacred information, a headdress, a staff, a bunch of things. And she gets there, and she makes sure that she can come back. And so she sends her attendant Ninshibur to the gods, and the gods help her out. In order to ensure that her body can be retrieved, the god Enki creates, quote, special beings which he sends to retrieve and rescue the goddess. So, these special beings that go to rescue Inanna are attendants to the mysteries of death and rebirth. Enki creates them from the dirt under his fingernails, and he sends them like flies, it's said, into the underworld so they can shift in between the living and the dead. And in most accounts of the attendants, they do not have a gender. In some accounts, they are transformed from one gender to the next. But there are two of them. And we have, those two attendants are the basis for the very real, politically written about, documented, gender-varying priestesses that were priestesses dedicated to the goddess Inanna in her temples. So what we know about these kinds of attendants, these priests, these priestesses, is that they hold the liminal space between life and death. Only they, because of either their gender ambiguity or their ability to change gender, can do what we cannot. Go down into the underworld, die, and come back. Because they transgress the normal bounds of reality. They're portal keepers. They're attendants to the mysteries of death and rebirth. So we move to Enheduanna, the world's first author, who wrote the hymn to Inanna and a bunch of other stuff as well. So Enheduanna is the first poet whose name we know. She's the first to claim authorship over her exaltations, lamentations, and poems dedicated to Inanna. So Sophus Hell is a writer who just released a new book in 2023, a translation of the complete poems. It's an excellent text, I highly recommend it. And he tells us that Enheduanna lived around 2300 BCE. She served as a high priestess in Ur, a city nestled in the southernmost corner of now what we might call Iraq. She was a daughter of King Sargon of Akkad and lived through a period of, quote, profound transformation. The world she was born into was not the same one that she left behind. Sargon founded the first empire that history had ever seen. So Enheduanna's installment of High Priestess of Ur, one of the largest cities in the empire, was probably part of this political overhaul. So revolts were customary, and Enheduanna's poetry reflects the times that she lived through. Her poems are hymns, exaltations, and battle cries. Her hymns hold power, persuasion, and are a means of defending oneself against the mood swings of the gods. Enheduanna's poetry gives us a glimpse into the past and into the lives and beliefs of herself and her people. So here we can see Inanna. I'd like to also point out that there are a bunch of different trees here, and that will come into play. If we notice, some of the iconography is beginning to line up in terms of mother goddess worship. There's a big crown, the star of Inanna, sometimes known as Ishtar, and then Ishtar is sometimes mashed together. And it's very beautiful. Okay. So in the hymn to Inanna, Enheduanna qualifies the mighty powers of the goddess Inanna. She also makes a note of the transformative powers in verse 80 when she says, "She set a great burden on their body, blessed them, and named them the Pili Pili. She snapped a spear and gave it to them as if they were men. And later, to turn men into women, to turn women into men are yours, Inanna." There are also references to the goddess herself being able to transform herself into a man when the need arose, particularly when she entered the battlefield and destroyed mountains. So we have more evidence to support this claim from writing. So evidence of paradoxical existences, gender transgression, and professional gender-fluid religious attendance aside, the ancient world of the Near East are not without conflict regarding this concept of the Pili Pili. So during the 12th century BCE, the Assyrian king, we're going to try this out, Ninurta Tukulti Ashur, was usurped by his own brother, bastard, Mutikil-Nusku. The former king sought refuge in Babylonia. In a letter addressed to Mutikil, the author spoke of his brother in a poor light, stating that the former king is a Kugara and not a real man. Pellet believes that in this context, being transgender was an insult, an antonym of manliness and masculine conduct, as used by the author in order to ridicule the king's brother. The notion that to be transgender was an assault on masculinity would become more prominent as patriarchal warring societies continue to spread across the globe, bringing their patriarchal religious and cultural beliefs with them. So, as I mentioned with Addis, sometimes we have writing that is not so nice, but we have it, which means it was real, existed, proves that people were worried about something, but they didn't like something that was going on over there, and so they wrote about it. So, this is important as well. So there are another text in regards to the hymn of Inanna. There's other texts and writings that says, these two she changed, renamed the Reed Marsh Woman and Reed Marsh Man, ordained sacred attendants of ecstasy and trance, the head overturned Pili Pili, the chief hero Kurbara. So we're going to take a second to go to the Bible. We're going to go there in just a moment. But if I said head overturned right, does anything come to mind? It's okay if it doesn't, that's what I'm here for. I'm going to tell you what it is. What is a marsh made of? Water, earth, both these things. So a head overturned right, we believe, is a baptism. The head is overturned, it goes into the water. That's important to note. So turning to the Bible, and some additional instances of gender transgression and fluidity. I listened to a really wonderful talk at a conference recently by a professor named Frodo Okulam, and she said that the crossing over between genders allows the Galator and Kugara to more easily cross between worlds and states of being, between life and death, ecstasy, and lamentation. So the reed marsh people in the Bible, this is a picture of the Jordan River. These are all of the reeds in the marsh that is the Jordan River. So the valley, the Kagara, the Galador, the Kili, they are known as the reed marsh people because the reed marsh is also in liminal space. It is a space between water and dry land. Okay. So here, we're going to talk a little bit about creation. Oh, look, another tree. What do you know? What's that doing there? So in the biblical book of Genesis, it says, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. It doesn't say, so in that text, I think it's Genesis, verse 26 or 25, there is no gender associated to God. God says, in our image, they. And then we have to realize that translation is a fun thing, right? So actually, in Hebrew, Adam or Adama means soil or earth, meaning creation, human. It doesn't actually mean man. It just means human, the soil of the earth. And Eve is the English translation of Hava, which is to breathe, living. So all God does is breathe life into the soil. And then right after that, when their gender does all of a sudden get assigned, God talks about, and you will have trees that bear fruit. So now we're talking about fertility. So now we name genders because I'm trying to demonstrate that I'm breathing life into the soil to make creation. But we have taken these texts quite literally, which we should not do in any sort of religious or spiritual or ancient text. One, besides the fact that we don't have a perfect translation of Aramaic anywhere, but also because it's filled with poetic and flowery language. So we have more reed marsh people in the Bible, of course, in Exodus 2. Moses is hidden in a basket among the reeds along the banks of the Nile because the Egyptians had just decreed that all the firstborn Jewish children must die. So instead, Moses' mother places him in a basket among the reed marshes and sends him on his way, while his sister Miriam watches over the transformation. So it says, then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. So Moses is a Galator, and his sister Miriam is a Kogara. I'll expand on that in a moment. So Moses also parts the Reed Sea and leads the people out of freedom. So actually, Red Sea is a mistranslation. Wouldn't you know? So the Reed Sea. In the Exodus narrative, Yamsuf, the Hebrew, Romanized, Yamsuf, I believe, means, literal translation means Reed Sea. That is the literal translation of that. So sometimes translated as Sea of Reeds is a body of water which the Israelites crossed following their exodus from Egypt. The same phrase appears in over 20 other places in the Hebrew Bible. This has traditionally been interpreted as referring to the Red Sea, following the Greek Septuagint's rendering of the phrase. So, as we know, we go from translation to translation to translation, but translations are often wrong. We're not perfect. So we go from the Red Sea, we go from the Reed Sea to the Red Sea. So when that happens, Moses' sister Miriam sings the Song of the Sea. That's Exodus 15. Miriam and the Israelite women sing a song of victory. Then Miriam the prophet, Aaron's sister, picked up a hand drum. You mean a tambourine? That thing that all of them are holding? And Miriam chanted for them. And another translation from the Hebrew Bible says, and Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dances. And if you can see this image, you can probably see it better on my computer, there are two different forms of dress here. And I know this is an interpretation, but we have our trees. We have the sistrum in the back, which the galator would use. And we have the hand drum, or the tambourine, thank you. The tambourine in the front that the kugara would use. So to clarify, the galator are men who become women, and the kugara are women who become men. And they're in different dress. The hair is shorter, the hair is longer. Another example from the Bible is the Last Supper. So in Luke 22, verse 10, as you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters. Now, this is a little more speculation and harder fact than I've given, but I wanted to include it because I find it to be really important. So as we mentioned, Crete was a matrilineal society. So when we see men carrying water jugs or libation bearers, that makes a little more sense. The rest of the ancient world, it doesn't. That was considered women's work. And so to see a man doing women's work would be unusual. And there is some argument in places that say, well, Jesus is just a great prophet, and he knew that this guy would be doing this strange thing, so they would notice him. Maybe. Or they went to the Gate of Essenes in Jerusalem, which is what the Bible said he did. And a man walking around with a jar of water was a very unusual sight. And this was ordinarily women's work. The only group of Jewish men that traditionally did carry water jars were Essenes. Essenes were mostly celibate, probably because they were castrated. And any priest or priestess of the goddess was usually celibate, unless there was fertility ritual taking place. And their men did women's work, and they stayed in their own communities. I'm just going to put the information out there, and you can make your own assumption about that. But it is, in my mind, a galator that leads the men to the upper room for the Last Supper. John the Baptist and Jesus. So in the Christian scriptures, we find the wilderness of the Jordan River with John the Baptist in many different instances. So John is a counterculture figure. He's a hippie. He has camel hair clothes. He eats locusts and wild honey. So he's a hippie, but he's not a vegan because he eats locusts, right? So, but he lives on the outskirts of the city. People always go, oh yeah, the guy over there doing whatever he's doing. But Jesus undergoes the head overturned rite, baptism, and the symbol of the goddess Asherah comes to him in the form of a dove. I'll speak more on her in a moment. But all it says in the Bible is that the Spirit comes down and speaks. But the Hebrew word for spirit or wind is feminine. When we translate it, it becomes spirit, God, whoever it is. But the word is feminine. So a feminine form of God comes down to speak. And it's only after Jesus received the head overturned rite of baptism that he does any of his ministry. He's doing some miracles here and there, but he doesn't go out and actually begin his ministry until he is baptized, until he becomes a galator and is visited by the goddess Asherah, who is Yahweh's wife. And this is in the book of Matthew. Another important thing to mention is that Asherah is associated with the water as well. So in many ancient civilizations, the primordial mother goddess or the primordial mother primordial waters of creation are creation waters. Creation takes place in the waters and is associated with the goddess. In Babylonia, it would have been Tiamat. In many Eastern cultures, it's a goddess as well. But there are texts known as the Ugaritic texts. They're early cuneiform, which is also what Sumerian language is, the tablets. And they reveal a mythology of the early Canaanite people. And a lot of mythology makes its way into the Bible, just in sneaky little ways. You have to be looking for it. And there's a great deal of conversation around the cult of Yahweh and Asherah. So she's also, the Ugaritic texts tell us that she walks on water about 1,400 years before Jesus does so. So Jesus receives the head overturned right, the dove, the white dove, her symbol comes down. And one of the things that Jesus is then able to do in order to convince people to follow him is walk on water. So at that time, people would have known this and associated it with the goddess. Another important thing to mention that happens a lot with deity in general is that sometimes they are invoked in the text as their location, where they live, the city or the town that they're in. So it could have said Yahweh and Zion. And Zion could have been referring to Asherah because that is where she is housed. So there's all this sort of language that is typically lost to us unless we know that we're looking for it. And this sort of imagery and symbolism is also lost to us because how many have read the Ugaritic texts telling us that Asherah walks on water? So my assertion again is that Jesus was a priest of the goddess Asherah. And when the Spirit comes down, the Spirit says that I am pleased that you have done this. And by pleasing the goddess, he begins his missionary work, if you will. So Jesus himself is an embodiment of the goddess. Oh, look a tree. So Asherah's Ugari epitaph, the one about her walking on water, says, Lady who treads on the sea, Lady Asherah of the sea, goddess of the sea. So we are dipped into the sea, into the water, to receive this transformation. So in Genesis, it's also important to note that Noah releases a dove to find land, and it brings back the branch of an olive tree. And you guessed it, that is the tree associated with Asherah. And many people call it the Asherah pole. So the Asherah pole was either a piece of wood, a branch, a tree, typically an olive tree that was placed next to an altar or sacred site that was dedicated to her. So here we can see a representation of destroying the Asherah pole. I'm going to have to. I was doing well, but I can't see that much. So an Asherah pole is a sacred tree or a pole that stood near a Canaanite altar or ritual space. And a bunch of ancient texts speak of Yahweh casting aside his consort or wife Asherah and abusing her children. And there's a lot of Ugaritic texts as well that speak to Yahweh being so angry that the people won't give up their worship for Asherah. No, you cannot have any other gods but me. Why aren't you listening to me? So I'm going to send a bunch of things that are going to hurt you and make you sad and upset because this happened. So, we know that Yahweh is actually kind of like mean and nasty and not very nice, and she has to plead with him to not to continue to hurt her children. So in Exodus 34 it says, rather you must tear down their altars, smash their sacred stones, chop down their Asherah poles. Deuteronomy says, this is what you are to do to them. Tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire. This is the New American translation. You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah of any kind of tree beside the altar of the Lord your God. In the Aramaic Bible in plain English, do not plant for yourself a grove of any tree on the side of the altar of Lord Jehovah your God, which you shall make for yourself. So why does this matter? Why do we care, right? Who cares about any of this, right? it matters for a few reasons, or we wouldn't be here. One of them is that it has real-life implications for people in the modern age, right? So, according to an article published on March 28th in 2023 by Rolling Stone, former Fox News anchor Tucker Carlson believes that the trans movement is targeting Christians. The author of the article, Nikki Ramirez, writes that the extended segment labeling transgender people as the natural enemy of Christianity came the day after a shooter, who the police identified as transgender, shot and killed 6 people, including 3 children, at a private Christian school in Nashville, Tennessee. In an impassioned monologue, Carlson told viewers that the trans movement is a mirror image of Christianity and therefore its natural enemy. I think the irony is palpable, since we've been here for an hour, right? So, the irony here after listening to this presentation should be apparent. Unfortunately, the lack of knowledge and awareness around gender transgression in history and in our most sacred religious texts leads to feelings of bigotry, hatred, and prejudice. So in the ancient world, in the ancient religious world, transgender people were sacred beings that navigated the liminal space between lamentation and ecstasy. They created liminal spaces of consciousness where normal distinction, including gender and gender performances, are suspended and done away with. They usher in praises of the goddess through a procession of wild and frenzied celebration and lamentation as seen in the frescoes of Crete, described by ancient onlookers in Phrygia, and exclaimed by Enheduanna when calling on Inanna. They play instruments, dance, sing. This desire for a full embodied expression of self can be understood through the lens of repression in modern society. And when I contemplate the conservative patriarchal religious doctrines in today's age, I find that even myself as a cisgendered woman feel that I don't have the permission to express every corner of my nature. The male divinity-centered religious practices of the 21st century feel limited in their ability to encompass all aspects of human life, death, and regeneration in the way that the cultic worship of the Great Mother did. The power and persuasion of gender transgression that allowed worshippers to become reunified with the Mother by transforming their bodies to mirror that of the goddess would be considered radical in today's society, but radical might just be what we need. So, in an article published in The Guardian in 2020, Sam Levin states that more than 50% of trans and non-binary children in the U.S. contemplated suicide. The Trevor Project released statistics stating 34,000 queer and trans youth aged 13 to 24 showed alarmingly high rates of suicide attempts, depression, and anxiety across liberal and conservative regions. In a 2023 survey, the Trevor Project reported that nearly 1 in 3 LGBTQ young people said their mental health was poor most of the time or due to anti-LGBTQ policies and legislation. And nearly 2 in 3 queer young people said that hearing about potential state or local laws banning people from discussing queer people in school made their mental health worse. Additionally, PBS reported that in 2022, at least 32 transgender people were killed in the US alone. But what if we remembered? What would happen if we remembered, if we unearthed, if we held ourselves sacred, if we dared to step into the full expression of ourselves? People watching others be unapologetically free in their expression can be frightening and unnerving for men. But what many people consider to be new and alternative in regard to gender expression is actually ancient and sacred. If we can remember our ancient origins, our sacred lineages, and our connection to the goddess, spirituality, the earth, the universe, then we will remember that transgender people have always been here and will always be here. By remembering our past before the impact of patriarchy, male-centered religions, and colonization, we can actually decolonize our religious spaces by making room for people of all gender expressions and variants. And I will leave you with a question posed by Jen Dow. Is transgender identity a perversion on normalcy, or is normalcy a perversion on the natural variety of the soul? Thank you. So I know this is a great deal of information, so before we get into any discussion or Q&A, I wanted to offer a brief meditation for grounding and transformation of whatever kind you wish to have in your life. So I know many of us are in chairs, but if you want to close your eyes and get comfortable, take a few breaths. I have with me a replica of one of the instruments, a sistrum, and we will use it to tap it. If you want to take a couple of cleansing breaths, let the day wash over you. Let all the traffic go away. Let it out. And imagine that you find yourself in a warm woods, summer evening, calm breeze. The sun is going